All right, this is Stephen Paul making another video for ornaments.com. We're going to continue my testing my heuristics series today and look at turn double barrel range construction in single raised pots. So here I've got a hand that kind of motivated this video, but first I'll kind of talk through some of my general ideas about the situation, and then we'll look at this hand in particular. We'll do some training, and then we'll look at some real hands that I've played. I got a couple of comments in the last one that it was nice to have the real hands, so I think I will try to make that a regular part of this series going forward. Okay, so my first overall thought is that in general, and I put the caveat of within reason, don't do anything completely crazy, but in general, turn size doesn't matter that much. If you go back to the flop, I think that matters even less. You know, make a sizing choice that you can consistently apply and worry about how to play that size. I think largely that is true about the turn, less true about the turn, but still, you know, again, within reason, you're going to do just fine if you pick one size. By the time you get to the river, now sizing starts to matter more, and you know, likely you're going to want two sizes in some spots. But on the turn, basically, I would say just make some size rules and stick to them. So I will show you what I use. It is not complicated, and I think, yeah, if you have a simple system that you can execute well, I think you will do much better than trying to implement many sizings on many different textures. So what matters most to me, and I think in general, is the range construction you choose given the size. So here are my size rules. Again, I always encourage you to make your own. You're going to remember your own better, but just to show you that it can be extremely simple. So if the turn is a blank, then I'm going to use a polar size, generally pot or bigger. If the turn is not a blank, so if a flush draw completes or an offsuit straight draw completes, then I will tend to use the 50%. This can also apply to some board pairs. I didn't include board pairs in here just because it is a little more situation dependent. And there are board pairs where I think playing polar makes better, and there are board pairs where I think you need to, if you use a polar size, you just can't bet very often. So on those, I tend to use a smaller size. But in general, I think this covers, you know, most turn situations. As far as what pot plus means, that just has to do with what size I used on the flop. So the bigger the flop size I use, kind of the closer to just, you know, pot size bet I will use on the turn. Whereas, you know, if I bet 25 on the flop, then my large turn size might be something more like 150 or 175. Okay, so what are some things we should think about when we are using either the small bet or the big bet? So to me, I think the smaller bets tend to be the tougher ones. And in large part, it's because we tend to make many thinner bets for value. And you kind of get this situation of what I call a messy value threshold. So when you bet very large, what tends to happen is it's like, these hands want to bet, you know, top pair, second kicker or whatever, and better. Basically always bet. You know, maybe you have a couple of slow plays from a top set kind of hand. But in general, it's very clear. Once you start going to these smaller bets, you see a lot more of this kind of messiness of like, this hand, you know, whatever, top pair, third kicker bets often, and top pair, you know, bottom kicker will still occasionally bet, and you'll get some kind of mergy second pair bets as well. So things tend to be messier for the smaller bets. The other thing you see is that out of position obviously has to continue wider when you bet smaller. So what I'm calling medium, you know, quote unquote draws can retain some equity. So that could be like 2 overs to second pair, which, you know, so let's pick a board. Let's imagine we're playing king 8-3 and the turn is a 2. And let's say you decide to use a small bet. Well, now a hand like Jack 10 is maybe a reasonable bet. You'll still get called by some 8x. You will have 6 outs on the turn. Whereas if you're going to use a big size, that hand probably makes significantly less sense, because when you get called, it's basically by a king, and your Jack and 10 outs are useless. So the larger bets, as I said, tend to be a little easier to implement, in my opinion. There's a much clearer value threshold. You also, you know, because we're betting larger, there's a narrower continue range. And so blockers tend to matter more. There are just fewer combos that out of position is continuing with. And so, you know, having a positive blocker can be worth significantly more. And then, so when you're choosing your bluffs, what you'll typically want, now this tends to be super clean out of position. Out of position, you basically just want some equity and some hands that will retain equity. In position, things get messier again, but you're kind of looking for one or more of a hand that will retain some equity. We'll talk about that when we play some hands, but this is the idea that even after you get called, you still have some live equity. A useful blocker or a useful unblocker, or 2 useful unblockers. So again, we'll see some examples as we play hands, but there are situations where on the turn in position, so let's pick a board. I imagine it's some like ace queen 7 turn 3 or 2. You might see a hand like 6-5 that does a decent amount of betting, whereas a hand like Jack 9 will do significantly less betting. So 6-5 kind of doesn't interact with those weak like Jack 7, Queen 9, etc. type hands that will call the flop and have to fold the turn. And then the last thing is, and this kind of goes along with the equity retention, is that you don't want to waste the equity. So again, if we go back to that King 8, 3, 2, if we are choosing a large sizing on the turn, which I would do, you don't really want to take a hand that could check back and have 6 pretty clean outs. If we bet small on the flop and see a turn and we have something like, I don't know, 10-9. 10-9 has 6-ish outs. If we check back, we will very often be against an 8 or against some pocket pair or against a 3 or against ace high. And it will have some equity. Whereas when we bet the turn and get called, if we bet large on the turn and get called, we basically will have 0 equity. And so those types of hands tend to not get used in the larger bets. Okay, so I do want to look at this one particular hand first. So I was just training unrelated to this video the other day and came upon this spot. So it's open button, big blind calls, check, bet small, call, and turn is the 9 of diamonds. Check. And I basically just autopilot checked. I think this hand is a pretty clear check in general. And you can see that it is. Right after I clicked it, though, I did start to think about what are some situations where I might choose to bet this hand instead. So I would encourage you to pause for a minute and think about that. These kinds of things, it's very easy, and I am extremely guilty of this, to be quote unquote training, but you're just kind of clicking buttons. And yeah, I think you can get a lot more out of thinking about what could change about the situation in order for, basically why are we checking and what could change to make us want to bet this hand? Because there are many situations where we will want to bet a hand like this. So I assume you have paused and written down your list of reasons. So the two that come to mind for me are, one, if ranges were tighter. So you can imagine something like under the gun versus big blind, or maybe in some kind of 3-bet pot. There are many situations where this will make a good semi-bluff. And the second one is, and again, this is basically the same idea, just ranges are tighter, if we had bet larger on the flop. So what I was thinking about after clicking check and pausing here for a minute was, what if I had overbet the flop? I'd like to use big sizes on these kind of ace, especially the ace big lows. But even on a board like this, I think overbet is a fine size. And we'll see in a second that solver uses it some. It's not the preferred size, but it's there. What if I had overbet the flop? Would I then want to use this hand as a bet? And I think if we go back to kind of our rules about the larger bets, we see kind of two things that make this kind of an attractive bet. So blockers matter more because of the narrower continuing range. We have kind of two useful blockers, especially, the 10 blocks, Jack 10. 10-9 probably just folds flop when we overbet, so I'm not so worried about that. But Jack 10 and Ace 10 for sure. We block. And then especially if you have the Queen of Diamonds, then you block some very clear continues, like Queen Jack of Diamonds in particular. Also, the Queen blocks a bit of Queen 8 and a bit of King Queen that will sometimes slow play the flop. So very useful blockers. The blockers matter more because of the narrower continuing range. And it does retain some equity. Even when we get called, we're going to fold some better hands for sure. And we're going to get called by hands that we're not doing great against, but we will still have, the open ender is relatively live and the 10 will be live some. So my guess prior to looking at the sim was that this hand would be a pretty good bet had we overbet the flop. And so we can take a look. So here we've got the range when we bet small on the flop. And you can see solver likes using big on the relative blank here. I don't think you have to overbet. I think whatever size you choose would be fine as long as you don't go, super tiny. But you can see that Queen 10 doesn't really like to bet. If we take a look at the equity of Queen 10, it's still got 41%. So when we bet small on the flop, we're still getting called by some worse 10x. And I think the pocket pairs probably just fold this flop, but we're still getting called by a bunch of worse 10x. And so, we have reasonable equity. If you compare that to when we bet large on the flop, if we take a look at Queen's End's equity, you can see it has significantly less, only 30%. So here, when we check turn and it goes check on the river, we're going to win fairly often. Here, that's going to happen significantly less. So yeah, this hand plays better as a check when we bet small. It has some nice properties for betting large. And you can see that, the preferred size, if we look at strategy and EV, you can see that the preferred size does seem to be the larger sizes. And it makes sense, right? There's not a whole lot of point in betting small with this hand. If you bet small with this hand, you will get a few folds from better hands, but you're basically just putting in money against a range that has a significant equity advantage against you. Whereas when we bet large, we're going to get folds from a lot of better hands. All the king jacks, king tens, a bunch of ace x. Whereas if we bet, if we bet small, yes, we'll still get a couple of folds, but we're getting many more calls from these, weak but stronger hands than ours. Okay, so I think that is a good place to stop there, and we'll do some training and kind of talk about these ideas as we go. Okay, so for these, I'm going to use the GTO simple. So I'm going to play maybe I'll play like 10 or 15 hands where we've used a small flop bet. Then we'll switch to using kind of a middling flop bet and then a large flop bet, and talk about the differences. Okay, so we have a 33, a 66, and a big. So I'm going to use this as my polar size. Honestly, I'm not too worried about the difference between this and this. I tend to lump these into kind of a 50% size. I think it's kind of up to you. Okay, so we get a board pair, which is not one of the rules we had here. I think there are two reasonable approaches here. One is to play large bet or check, and there we are mostly going to polarize to a strongish king or better and mix in some bluffs. And the other strategy is to include a decent amount of smaller bets. And in that case, we're probably still betting hands like pocket sixes and up with some regularity. I think if you are choosing the large size only, it's probably somewhere around king 10 would be the kind of weakest pure value bet. So I'm gonna choose the large size. I think the small size is fine as well, and we'll go for this. As far as bluffs go, I think that is the difficult thing when you're choosing bluffs on these when the top card pairs. It's a little awkward. I think a hand like. Well, so you'll have some draws that will be totally reasonable bluffs. And then as far as the totally random hands, it's difficult to say. I mean, I don't hate a hand like ace of spades 6 or something like that. I also don't necessarily hate a hand like jack 10, where there we're playing primarily on our blockers, just blocking the strongest king X that will always continue. But here with king 10, I think I would mostly bet, and so on 8, I will bet. Looks like that's the size. It looks like solver on this particular one wants to bet more of the middling size, and so I imagine it is betting a decent amount of the pocket pairs as well. Yes, you can see that it is. If we isolate for just the big size, we still get a few of the pocket pairs going for it, but it does look to be primarily the strong kings. Looks like king jack pretty regularly, king 10 a little less, and king 9, king 8 not really. Bluffs, we do see that kind of ace of spades 6, although also ace 6 with a spade. The nice things about these are they block some clear continues, and they have potential bluffing cards on future streets. I'm just curious about other hands that get used. Yeah, some random kind of jack 9 type hands that have some blockers, queen 9, queen 10. And if we take a look at the continuing range for out of position, you're going to see like all of these strong kings are obviously pure continues. And so the nice part about a hand like jack 10 is twofold. It has some blockers, but it also does retain a bit of its equity, right? It's getting called by the pocket pairs and getting folds from some better hands. All right, next hand. Okay, so again, this is not a board I would use the small size, but if you choose to, again, I don't think it's a big deal. The turn ace is interesting because both players will have a reasonable number of ace X. And so it's difficult to decide in these spots. Again, do I want to use, you can use the big size and probably polarize to something like ace jack or better. You could also choose a smaller size. I don't think this hand makes a ton of sense to bet regardless. We block some kind of somewhat weaker hands, like 7, 6, 9, 7, king jack, king 10, those kinds of hands. So I don't think this hand makes a ton of sense to bet for any size. Personally, I like the big size. I often prefer the big sizes to anything else. Okay, it looks like it loves bluffing this one. So this is a situation where I would assume if we were out of position, we would never bet this. Having the clubs, well, let's take a look. I'm not sure about this one. So you can see that the king jack, king 10 like to bet. Let me just see what is continuing and see if we see anything there. So the king jack, king 10 are basically always folding. Most 7x are folding as well. So what does it love about king 7? It does retain a little bit of equity. We're still getting called by all the queen x. So actually, yeah, that's something I should have considered more. If we use the very large size, now I assume some queen x starts to fold. Yes. So king 7, basically pure bluffing. I just want to see if we take a look at the no hand, no draws. I guess they're just all going for it on this board. Interesting. I mean, I guess in general our range is quite strong on this board. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Yeah, if we take a look, we've got a pretty big advantage throughout. Out of position will have a decent amount of ace X, but probably not. I guess they really don't have much in the kind of 2-pair plus part of the range. All right, well, let's look at another. Okay, so on this board, so for me, I don't like big bets on this turn. 10-9 off has gotten there, as well as 5-4 off probably isn't full frequency in anyone's range, but big blind will have some. So I prefer the smaller sizes. This hand seems like one I would mostly want to bet. By the time you get up to like the queens, kings, aces, I can definitely see some checkbacks. I would basically always bet pocket 10s and pocket 9s, especially with the backup equity. I think jacks still want to bet fairly often. Again, I wouldn't use overbets here. I would probably use 50 as my size, but I think 66 is reasonable. Looks like the choice. And here I imagine the bluffs are primarily going to include a 9 or a 10, but you do still see some just totally random hands. Yeah, king jack, king 10 get in there fairly often, but only with a spade. King 10 starts to go for it with whatever. It's got the gut shot. Ace jack. These bets always surprise me. The ace queen is just a pure check back, but ace jack with a spade to me makes some sense. I'm a bit surprised to see, and I think it's very difficult to find those ace jack without a spade. You can see primarily though the bluffs are going to have one of the straight draws, a 10, a 9, or the 5x and 4x. All right, here I do like overbet as a size. No draws have completed. All of our kind of overpair plus are still very happy to overbet. I think most 9s will be happy to overbet as well. Excuse me. And then we'll have some very natural bluffs too with some of the turn straight draws. With the ace 5, just trying to think. Yeah, I mean, to me, this seems like a totally reasonable hand to continue bluffing with. I also think it's a fine hand to check. I don't think it's a must bluff. We do block some, like villain is going to have to continue most of the ace highs on this flop, and many of those will then be folding the turn. So the ace is kind of neutral-ish, I would say, to bad, but it does retain some equity. We have the over and we have the straight draw, obviously. So I'm going to bet this on 60. I imagine it's close. I think check back is fine as well. Yeah, it looks like predominantly bet, but a reasonable choice. Let's take a look. So here. All right, let me think about the kind of unnatural bluffs that I would want to use. So obviously there are gut shots and straight draws that should be used fairly often. I think the other ones, I don't think a hand like King Queen wants to bet here. I think possibly you'll see a hand like King 10 bet sometimes. It will get some better kings to fold. It has some useful, kind of bluffing properties on future streets. But so many of our hands have gut shots. It's actually very hard to come up with too many hands. So you might see a hand like King 7 suited or something like that go for it some as well. Queen 7 suited maybe more so. But let's take a look. So again, I like overbet here. Looks like solver likes overbet as well. We see all of those kind of straight draws used very often. Betting for a somewhat high frequency. All the overpairs happy to go for it. The strongest 8s even, I'm probably not going thin enough on the turn. These especially, I don't think I would find. So interesting. King Queen still does go for it. King Jack, King 10. These ones I'm less surprised by. With kind of the useful straight blockers. And yes, again, we do see these kind of King 7, Queen 7s. It's easy when you look at something like this to see why some people, obviously myself included on this board, are not bluffing enough. Because it's hard to always find the King Queen and to always find the every time the King 10 and every time the Queen 7. This one again I think makes more sense, but very difficult to always find the bluffs. Whereas it's extremely easy to always find the pocket 10s and always find the hands like that. All right, let's go for another. Queen 5-2 rainbow turn queen. It's funny because we had the turned king where my instinct was to use the large bet. Here, my instinct is to use the small bet, and what I'm hoping is not happening is that I am, I have a bad hand, so I think small bet, and earlier I had a good hand, so I think large bet. To me, though, I think the higher the top pair, so on an ace turn, on an ace XX board, I think big makes a lot of sense. King as well. By the time you start getting lower and lower, I tend to prefer the smaller bets. With 10-7, yeah, I mean, I'm just going to defer and say I don't think I know this spot very well. I imagine you don't love having diamonds. Like I would prefer to have clubs, because the weakest flop floats will be some kind of random diamonds hands, which will then fold the turn. If I were going to bet this hand, I don't think this hand wants particularly to be part of a huge bet. And if we use the kind of 66, I think it's a fine choice. We get folds from a bunch of better hands. We'll retain a little bit of equity, but probably I would lean towards checking this hand. That looks good, and it does get used some in the middling size. So here I imagine we're betting a bunch of pocket pairs if we're using the 66 size. Yes. And you see this, here's another thing that you see very often. So you see these kind of lower pairs. I think there's two things going on here. One is these lower pairs need more protection, or benefit more from protection while having very similar equity versus a continuing range. So like when you bet 8s versus 10s, the equity versus the continuing range is not that different. But the 8s have obviously a little more benefit from getting a hand like ace 10 or whatever to fold, or king 10 to fold. By the time you get up to pocket aces, there's a couple things going on. One, it doesn't require any of that protection, but also we block the kind of ace high floats on the flop that are just going to check down, and so we will face more bluffs on the river as well. All right, what else is going on here? So you can see some of that kind of messier threshold, although not so much. It's fairly clear at ace 5, not much lower. Although we do see some. Again, with the bigger sizes, you will tend to see more like, jacks will always bet too. If 10s are betting, jacks are betting. But for the smaller size, a little messiness there, but not too much. And the bluffs do indeed seem to come from the random-ish hands. Right, the other thing I was curious about, yes, clubs seem to bet a little more often and are a slightly higher EV bluff, but it's not as big an effect. I think, again, it's easy to overdo these things and think, okay, well, I wish I had clubs. I bet if I had clubs, but I don't. But if you're never betting the spades or diamonds, you're probably not bluffing enough. They are still going for it sometimes. Yeah, this one I would never use big, obviously. I think probably a board where big blind can do some donking, and I only allowed small. So yeah, I don't think big sizes make sense at all. Again, I would use 50. This hand to me seems like a perfectly good bet. We've got a bit of a free roll against some other 10x. I would just bet this hand pretty often, but interesting. I have it completely wrong. I'm not gonna look at this too much. It's such a rare board that I don't think it's worth spending time on. Here, I like large as a size. This hand will be a pure bet, and bluffs will primarily be the straight draws and some flush draws. As far as kind of random hands that I would use as a bluff, I think, again, a hand like, ace of spades 5 or something like that makes a lot of sense. Mostly, I think they're going to have some equity, though. All the kind of queen jack, queen 10, jack 10, other gut shots and open enders as well. I think if there are kind of pure air hands, they will fall into that ace X with a spade. Mixing sizes, but if you choose overbet, it's going to want to bet. Let's take a look at just the overbet. So again, we see relatively clean threshold. King queen going for it a ton. King jack a little bit. King 10 some as well. Doesn't get there that often. And then what are the no hand, no draws? Primarily these ace X. They like to have a spade, although it looks like by the time you get to the lower ones, those are mostly just going for it anyways. And then what are these totally random? You do get a little bit of the completely random. I guess queen 4, I mean, the 4, has no interaction really, which is kind of that unblocker, right? These are basically totally unaffiliated with the flop calling range. And the queen, I imagine the queen is nice because king queen is pretty high frequency to get here and is a pure call. But that's a relatively minor point. The queen also, it'll go for it, some on, say, a 10 or a jack river. So it is nice to have a few of those hands. Again, these are the kinds of hands, and we can look at this, king 8-3, turn 9. These are the types of hands that typically do not get used if you are playing out of position. So we had king 8-3, oops, small bet, call, turn 9. Yes, so now you see the queen 4 are basically pure give-ups. And if, whoops, no, it's not what I wanted. If we look at the no hand, no draw, you can see it is very much just these good ace-highs, or these kind of useful ace-highs that still retain a little bit of equity. You can see that the pure air now never goes for it, whereas in position that pure air was going for it some. Close these two. All right, let's play a couple more of these, and then we will switch. Typically on the paired boards, even on blanks, I would still stick to the smaller size. I don't think ace-jack really makes a whole lot of sense to bet. This is the 4 straight. I'm not going to worry too much about those boards. So this is one on the turn 8. This is one where I don't think the big size makes nearly as much sense. On the turn ace, I think it is very reasonable to polarize to your strongest ace-x. And as far as queen 10 goes, again, I can't imagine we're betting super high frequency in this spot. I'm not sure. I think these simple sims don't have a turn donk from big blind, but I could be wrong, and that's going to matter quite a bit. If big blind does not have a turn donk, we will bet less often. And so I don't think queen 10 makes a ton of sense. It's a fine hand to bet. Wow, it's even using some overbets. I'm mostly just curious here if there is a turn donk, just for future reference. Okay, there is. No flop donk, but yes, turn donk. All right, I think I will switch now. We'll use a bigger flop size. All right, so I'm going to use only the overbet. We'll do a few of these, and then we'll look at some real hand examples. So here I have I've tried to filter for boards that are ones that I would at least consider using overbet on. If we get one that's way out there, then we'll just skip it. Okay, so jack 8-4 rainbow, totally reasonable spot to use overbet. And turn 2, starting a flush draw, overbet would be my only size here. I think as far as value threshold goes, something like king jack. And then the turn bluffs, obviously this hand's going to be a pure bet. The turn bluffs I would use are going to be a decent amount of hearts. Some of the kind of queen 10, 10-9, queen 9. And then I think, as far as the kind of non-traditional or, as far as the kind of lower equity bluffs, let's say, I think a hand like king queen with a heart is the first one that springs to mind. Maybe a hand like ace of hearts 6. Obviously ace of hearts 5 and 3 are gut shots. So maybe those, and then definitely, the king queen, especially with a heart, maybe even sometimes without a heart. And then the ones I'm really wondering about are more the king 10 with a heart, which I think is a fine choice as well. But again, I think my original, and you've seen this in the earlier, is that it's easy to not bluff enough. And I'm wondering if I'm going to end up going a little too far the other way. But no, it looks okay here. So the king queen basically always goes for it, and the king 10 with a heart is a very reasonable choice. King 9 with a heart, I missed. These weaker ace X with a heart, yes, those go for it as well. Okay, and any other, just like totally random. So a little bit, and again, these are the ones. These ones are tough. It's hard to find the queen 6 of diamonds, but again, I also don't think you necessarily need to find the queen 6 of diamonds, right? If you choose, okay, I'm gonna simplify my life a little bit. I'm not gonna find these completely random hands, and I'm just gonna always go for it with king 10 with the king of hearts. You're going to be just fine. Obviously, you are never going to be able to play exactly like solver. All right, here's an interesting one. Again, super reasonable board to go for it on the flop. The turn is interesting. So I think not a bad choice, definitely. If we think about what villain is continuing with on the flop, he's going to have to, I think, so he's already going to fold a bunch of his king X unless it has a spade. His obvious turn folds, I think, are going to be hands like king of spades 9, which has to pure call the flop, but will fold the turn. His other clear turn folds are going to be hands like, so I believe on this board that even some ace 6, we bet 130 on the flop. Even some like weak ace X is going to be indifferent and maybe fold a tiny bit. But those are going to be his turn folds, are his random ace X. So I believe this hand, to me, is actually a very good choice. Maybe, sure, I would probably rather have, Jack of Hearts, 10 of Diamonds, or Jack of Spades, 10 of Diamonds. But I still think this is a fine choice. I think the bluffs are going to, these ones are probably mostly going to have some equity. I don't think we'll have any. I always worry when I say not any. But if there is a totally random bluff, no, I don't think there's going to be, because the problem with a hand like 6-5 of Diamonds, which is sometimes the choice, is that really blocks those flop floats, not floats, but like the ace 5 and ace 6 that are going to call flop and fold turn. So I'm going to use this hand, and I would not use the low ones. Okay, so it like 66, whatever. But it does primarily bet this hand. I guess 130 is pretty big when the straight draw has gotten there. But let's take a look. Okay, so I want to see no made hand, no draw. They do still go for it sometimes. Man, these are tough. Pretty often too, really. I mean, so they don't bet the flop very often, which is one thing. So even though it looks like, what is it, 20% or something, it's like 20% of the 10% that it bet the flop. But I'm a little disappointed in that. Okay, the Jack 10 does love to go for it. Jack 10 basically always going for it. And let's see, was I right about... So first of all, let's check the flop, because I'm pretty sure these ace 6s and things, they are indifferent. They fold a tiny bit, but not much. I wouldn't count on people making these folds in game, if we're being honest, but solver does fold them sometimes. And then when we bet the turn, primarily the folds are coming from ace X. And what are these? Oh yeah, the bad spades. I should have thought of that. The bad spades fold as well. The weak aces fold. And so this is what I was thinking, is I don't really want a hand like 6-5 of Diamonds, because I block some of these weak ace X hands that have called the flop and folded the turn. But I guess we just need to find some bluffs. Jack 10 loves it. The rest of them have a jack or have a queen. So I think, again, my goal is not to be perfect here. I think if you just cut out all of these random low diamonds and always use the random jack X, you're going to do just fine. Yes, your river range will end up being a little messed up, but I'm not good enough to worry about that, let's say. So this one I would not overbet the flop, so we'll skip it. This one I do like overbet the flop. And I don't think there's too much to talk about with this particular hand. I would always blast off. Again, these sizings are slightly awkward in that this is like more than the geometric for two streets. I would use slightly smaller on the flop and slightly smaller on the turn, but not a big deal. But I would always go for it with this hand. Again, I think we're going to see a lot of similar things. Mostly the hands are going to have some equity. You will see some ace of spades X, maybe a hand like ace of spades 5. Maybe some like king X of diamonds too. Hands like that. Again, what you want to think about in these spots are like, what are the hands that call the flop and fold the turn? And here, I think those hands, well, let me think for a second before so some 10X is definitely going to fold. Obviously, all the 10X will have called the flop. Other hands that make a lot of sense to call flop fold turn are like 7X of hearts and 3X of hearts. And there will be some pocket pairs with a spade, although when you bet 130 on the flop, I think a bunch of those fold already. But anyways, I'm going for it with this hand. Again, I prefer something in between these two sides. I'm not going to worry about it much. Okay, aces, always going for it. Bluffs are primarily going to have equity, so we see a bunch of gut shots going for it. But what we're curious about in this is what are the no hand, no draws. And indeed, we see these kind of ace X. I mean, again, I'm missing, not going for it enough with these. But these hands all make sense, right? We have some kind of useful-ish blocker. We retain a little bit of equity. Again, same idea with these king 8 of diamonds or whatever, where you still are going to have equity when you get called. You're going to get called by a bunch of one pairs, and you will sometimes river those, which is nice. Whereas you do not necessarily use a hand. Here it's hard because all these hands that are going to have some equity in the check line, although maybe Jack 8's a decent example where the Jack will be good, somewhat often. The 8 will be good somewhat often. Obviously, it's got a gut shot, but you don't necessarily want to bet the hands that, when called, lose most of their equity. Here again, it's tough to find those because most hands just have equity. All right, let's do 2 more, and then we will look at some real hands. Okay, so I'd like overbet on this flop. I would not use overbet on this turn when the offsuit straight draw. Really, the only 100% continue kind of draw. King queen probably continues all the time too, but gets there. So I would use 50. Whatever, we'll use one of these. This seems like a prime choice, so I'm going to go for it. As far as the other bluffs, I think they will primarily have a queen or a 10 in them, and those that don't probably will have the ace of hearts pretty often, or an ace and a low heart. What about the totally random air? I mean, again, there's not a lot of it, but like, does 6-5 of clubs go for it sometimes? Maybe we will see. So this hand does quite like to bet, sometimes checks, but mostly betting. What we're really interested in are the low equity ones. So we do see that kind of ace high, mostly with a heart again, and there they are, the 6-5 of diamonds. Interesting, not the clubs this time. Again, I don't want to worry too much about the very specifics of the suits. Again, the thing to keep in mind with these though is what you do not want to do is learn, okay, 6-4 of diamonds makes a good turn bluff here, and then end up always potting 6-4 of diamonds on the flop. 6-4 of diamonds, does a decent amount of checking on the flop, and then when it gets to the turn, still doesn't always bet. So if you start betting these hands often on the flop, you can very quickly get, completely lose your mind, basically. So careful with that, I will say. All right, last one, and then we'll look at some real hands. Not a board I love the big bet on, but a fine turn bet, I think. Like turn bet here, very clear bet as well. And I think this one we're just going to see a lot of the things we have seen already, where mostly they'll have some equity, otherwise they will have an over and ideally some useful blocker or no blocker. So yeah, I think a hand like King 5 of diamonds is fine, Queen 5 of diamonds, and then you'll see a lot of hands with the ace of hearts or spades, I believe, or an ace and a spade. But yes, so we see ace of spades, 6 of hearts loves it. Ace of hearts, 6 of spades, gets in there reasonably often. The ones with no suits, even still, actually getting in there sometimes, which is interesting. These have gut shots. Let's look at the no draws. And yeah, you do see the King 6, King 5, etc. of diamonds going for it fairly often. These going for it sometimes. And again, I'm just gonna say this one last time. Be careful about overdoing it on the flop with these. It's going to be fine against some people. It's hard to have a hand that is good enough to withstand bet 130, bet 130. So you're already folding some strong 10x and some weak jack x on the flop. And on the turn, have to fold a bunch more of the jack x and a bunch of the 10x. So just don't blame me, let's say, when you go bet jam with Queen 5 of diamonds. Because the other thing to keep in mind is like, what is the purpose of the Queen 5 of diamonds? And I mean, the purpose is to some degree that there are going to be some rivers where it is a good bluff. And so primarily those are going to be the non-spade, non-hearts. But you can see it's now a pretty clear bluff. You are making a 3.5 big blind mistake if you check back Queen 5 of diamonds on the turn. But again, what you don't want to do is be the guy who gets to the river with 100% of all of these, and the obvious exploit is to just always click call when you bet the river. All right, so I'll stop there. I'll load up some of my own hands, and we'll take a look and try to find some leaks in my play. All right, so I just loaded up kind of the last couple months of play, where I have c-bet flop, gotten called, and had the opportunity to c-bet turn. And we'll take a look. Trying to think. Right, I also filtered for only on the button, just to have the widest ranges, and that's what we've been practicing. So I think I would just range c-bet this board. I think that will play totally fine. And then on the turn, like I said, I don't typically like the large bets on the turn when the flop was paired. It's reasonable if big blind check raises way too many 10x on the flop, but I think in general you don't see a ton of large bets here. I vaguely remember this hand. I think it's not the worst choice in the world, but when we bet small on the flop, we still have definitely some showdown value with the ace x. And so I chose to, I think I pure checked. Looking at it now, I don't mind this as a bet. I think I would rather bet kind of the weaker my side card is, but let's take a look. Jack 10, 10 rainbow. And then the turn was a 3 suited to the 10. Wait, I guess here I would use 66 if I were going to use a size. Oh, sorry. Why did we never get here? Right, because solver does not want to overbet. Yeah, it's not quite a range bet, but honestly, for my purposes, that is close enough. We'll do a 3 suited to the 10, and we're going to have ace X and then the 7 of hearts in this spot. So I would not use any large bets. Looks like solver does use some, but not a ton. As far as the air bets, to me, it looks like this is largely similar. Most things have equity. The weaker hands will at least have an overcard to the jack. There's not much in the way of complete air. And then you do see these ace X. Looks like I mostly had this wrong in terms of wanting the weaker ace X to bet more. It looks pretty even across the board, but you do want a heart. And so definitely one where I did not bet as often as I should have. And I think we just checked it down. Leads to a better ace. Okay. This one, not a board I would c bet range, but obviously a fine board to c bet, and my hand will bet sometimes we get called. Here, I like large as a size. And so a hand like a6 will generally not bet at all. With the clubs, I'm not sure. Maybe it'll now bet sometimes. Again, I think I pure checked this one in game, and then I called the river and lost to something I can't remember. But oops. Yeah, my thoughts are if you're going big, it's mostly going to have some equity. These ace high ones tend to be a little tougher though to find the other kind of random stuff. So if I were going to pick kind of a random hand, all the low stuff has gut shots. So mostly I think it'll have gut shots or a flush draw. Maybe a hand like Queen 6 or Queen 5 or something where like there are of diamonds where there's you have an overcard to some hands that might continue, and the 5 can be a useful blocker, but honestly I probably don't find much or any of those, and I would mostly just focus on having equity here. So it's ace 2 7 with hearts and clubs. Ace 2 7. Bet, call, turn 8. Again, this is a small bet on the flop. Let's just take a look at my hand. So I would not bet range. Yeah, quite a lot of checking. And a6 does a decent amount of checking with clubs. Yeah, again, just kind of roughly mixed. Turn 8. I wouldn't be super shocked if solver uses some smaller bets here too. I tend to err on the side of using the big bets. Yeah, you can see it uses some, but not a lot. And a6 is indeed a pure check. You can see a6 of clubs specifically can bet for kind of a smaller size, but doesn't really like betting for larger sizes. And we do see that kind of clean-ish value threshold where like top pair third kicker likes to bet quite a lot. And ace 10 bets some, and then the weaker ones tend to pure check. And then, okay, what are the random bluffs? Okay, so there is some of the Queen 10. Looks like in particular it wants a club. I guess that makes sense because if you imagine some of the weaker hands, they will be some club hands that will have called the flop and now will continue on the turn because they picked up a flush draw. Okay, yeah, definitely not finding enough of these. The King 10, the King 9, happening really quite often. And then what about some of these Queen 5, Queen 4s as well, where they have that kind of semi-useful blocker on, or useful card on some turns. They don't really have a whole lot of interaction with any part of a villain's range. When you bet small, he doesn't get to the turn really much at all with the 5 of spades or the Queen of spades. And so those do go for it sometimes. So definitely not finding enough of those. I do think though, what you will typically see, and what I'm looking at the wrong, what's going on? Something weird was happening with the 10-9. I do think what you typically see from humans, and probably myself as well, is too much of this Jack 10, Jack 9, 10-9, and not enough of the random air. Which is, kind of the problem with that is that, on a turn Jack or something like that, the human will often very much struggle to find bluffs because you don't have the the hands that become natural natural river bluffs on a Jack. All right. River call is whatever. Raise. I choose to c-bet. I'm assuming this is probably a weaker player because typically I would use overbet on this board. So let's skip that one. Here we go small. We get the turn. I think for a small size especially, I think my hand makes a good turn bet. and it looks like I do use the half pot. So again, most of the time on these paired flops, I am going to continue using smaller bets, and we get called. I think I remember this one. Probably I can even go slightly bigger for value, but yeah, jacks I would basically bet always. As far as the random air goes, again, mostly it's going to be gut shots and things, and then I think to me the hands that make sense are the kind of Jack 7 suiteds of the world, where the Jack is still going to be good fairly often. It's got some really nice potential, blocker effects on some rivers, and then maybe a hand like King 6, King 7 as well, where it will retain some equity. I think probably I would not use much of the ace X, although some of the weakest ace X maybe. Let's take a look. Queen 5, rainbow, turn, I believe was the full rainbow. Is that right? So again, no huge sizes. They're going to use 66. I use 50. Not a big deal. You see the pairs, go for it. Quite a lot. Okay, and as far as the bluffs, so yeah, again, I think my biggest takeaway from this is going to be that I was probably kind of quote unquote taking my showdown value, which is not a whole lot of showdown value when you have a6 too often with this type of hand. So I've got to find more of those bets, and then Jack 7 suited it loves apparently. But yeah, this kind of hand where you've got that double effect going on of you will retain some equity, and there are a bunch of rivers when now all of a sudden your hand will make very attractive bluff, and then the gut shot's going for it pretty often as well. Fine. Yeah, I think on this one, I like playing a more polar strategy, and I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to bet at Queen 4. We still have quite a bit of showdown value. I mean, especially without diamonds, I don't think I would ever bet this hand. With diamonds, you get like the slight temptation, but I don't think it's necessary at all. I think just a good check and then very clear check back on the river right. I believe this guy was going for the trap with the ace 4, but let's take a quick look. Ace 7 4. So again, not a board where you want to see bet range, although again it's going to work fine against most people. But solver does not want to see bet range, and then I like the big bet here because sure, a hand like pocket eights, does get some benefit from betting, and it looks like solver actually does want to use the smaller one, and really get that value and protection with the eights or better. But villain has a ton of ace X, and I slightly prefer the strategy where we play the more polar, and we're really focused on these. As far as turn bets, I mean, I should have talked about this, but yeah, it's going to be the hands that kind of retain some equity, especially when you bet small. A hand like Jack 10 and Queen 10, these are perfectly nice bets. You're going to get continues from a bunch of hands against which we have 6 outs, right? All of the 7x, a bunch of pocket pairs and things. By the time you start betting very large, now these hands start to fold more, and I would be less inclined to want to use a hand like Jack 10 in that case. All right. We raise. Again, I think range is totally fine here. Okay, I'm going to hope I went for this one because I think this is the kind of hand. Oh, I remember this hand. I do go for it, but then I wimped out on the river. So I'm actually curious about the river in this one. We go for the turn bet. I think this is just a good choice of hand. No real interaction with the with villain's range, and we do retain some equity with the kings. I think I like this one. Queen 10 10. Turn 2, right? Yes. Full rainbow. King 3 goes for it fairly often. Not for the overbet, but for the 66. So let's take the 66. And I think, again, and I talked about this briefly before, is sometimes you don't actually know what you're doing, and this is probably happening here in that you go for the turn bet, but I'm not really sure. I mean, there are some rivers like on an ace or a jack, I would bluff this hand every time. Maybe probably on a 9 as well, I would bluff this hand, but it's on the rest of the deck. I cannot say I'm super clear on the purpose of King 3 of clubs. So this will be an interesting one here. I figured, I'm also going to bluff some hands with a jack in them. Like here, these Jack 7 suits, like these are the hands that I assumed would want to bluff the river. As well as like maybe, 9-8's picked up equity. So looking at this now, I think probably the King 3 just wants to go for it on the river. but we'll see. We'll see in a second. Yeah, I assume the first bluffs are going to be these jack X's. But let's take a look. Yeah, king 3, just very, very, very clear. Go for it. And one where, yeah, let's just say I regretted it the second I click check. But yeah, all the 10s are going to continue to bet. The jack X's, yeah, that's interesting that actually the jack X's don't always go for it. I would have thought these are kind of nice with the kind of blocker-ish to jack 9, but it's not really so worried about that. It just checks back those for 0. And goes for it with the king 3. Does it? I'm just curious. I'm not sure if there are. No, yeah, there's no river report. But let's just take a quick look at a few others. So I said I would definitely go for it on a jack. I imagine that is happening. I would definitely go for it on an ace. I imagine that is happening. Yes, and then what I'm less sure of is, yeah, what if you just get the 6? Like king 3 of clubs kind of seems like an attractive bluff on just about every river. Is that indeed happening? Yes. So once you bet this hand, it's basically to go for it. And the hand, like jack X, is a little less, although as it gets lower and lower, it's more and more likely. And then my last question is just, what are we targeting exactly? A bunch of queens. So this makes me feel better about, let's just take a random, let's take the 8 that we saw in game. This makes me feel a little better about the give up, in that I'm not super, well, let me tell you, I do not expect king queen to fold when I bet 60% on the river. So yeah, I'm not too beat up about this give up, honestly. Although given what villain had, it's not good. But yeah, I am not anticipating most people are folding queen X. I was not anticipating people to float turn with ace 9 either, but that one hurt. Okay, bet flop, probably this is, well, no, I actually don't mind this. If you make the 6 and 8, now I start to like overbet, but this I think is fine. Turn 8 kind of completes a bunch of things, but none of them are the offsuit variety. So there's like 10-7 suited and there's 7-5 suited, but villain should not have any of the offsuit of either of those. So I actually don't hate big bet on this turn. And if I'm going to play big bet, I think jack 9 is a little too thin. If you're going to use small bet, then I think jack 9 would be fine. It looks like I did choose to use small bet, in which case I don't mind this at all. And then I think pretty clear check on the river. So let's take a look. We'll call this the last one, maybe. So 9, whoops, 6-4, is that right? Yes. And turn is an offsuit 8. Yes. Okay, so flop, we'll just take a look. I imagine solver will use a bit of everything. Yeah, mostly the small and the medium, not so much the large. Again, if you make that 6 higher, it may start to use more of the large. And then mixing in small and big bets. And if we look at jack 9, yeah, actually just a pure check, although you can see that the smaller the bet, the more reasonable it is. So pretty small EV mistake if you're using the small bet, very close to 0, 0.0 something. Whereas, it starts to get a little significant if you're using the larger bet size. Once you bet the turn, it's just going to be a pure check down on the river, which I did. That looks good. So, we only looked at 7 hands, and I saw at least 2 or 3 where it's like, I'm not thrilled with the way I played. I do feel like this video was actually very helpful for me in terms of better constructing those ranges. So hopefully it was for you as well. Yeah, let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see in future videos, and look forward to talking to you guys in the comments. This has been Steve Paul for OneNotes.com. Thanks for watching.